For most of my life, my family described me using one word: reliable. I was the person everyone called when they needed help moving furniture, filling out paperwork, understanding finances, or solving a problem they didn't know how to handle. I never minded. In fact, I liked being dependable because it made me feel useful. But over time, I started noticing something strange. The more reliable I became, the more invisible I became. People stopped appreciating help and started expecting it. Eventually, they stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a resource. That realization didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, one favor at a time, over many years. Looking back now, I can clearly see all the warning signs I ignored. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 42 years old, and I own a small accounting firm that I built from scratch over the last 15 years. It's not a giant company, but it's successful, stable, and more importantly, it provides a life I genuinely enjoy. I live in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. I drive an ordinary car, and I don't spend much time trying to impress anyone. If you met me, you probably wouldn't think there was anything remarkable about my life, and honestly, that's exactly how I prefer it. My grandfather used to say that peaceful lives are often mistaken for boring ones, and as I got older, I realized how right he was. Peace is actually one of the hardest things to build. My younger sister Rebecca couldn't have been more different. She was outgoing, emotional, and always seemed to attract attention without trying. We were close growing up, but adulthood changed our relationship. Not because we fought, but because our lives moved in different directions. Rebecca married Derek 15 years ago, and from the moment I met him, something felt off. He was charming in the way salespeople are charming. He knew exactly what to say and exactly how to say it. People loved him immediately. My mother adored him. My sister defended him constantly. Relatives praised him every chance they got. I was the only person who never fully trusted him. And over the years, I learned to keep those opinions to myself, because every time I expressed concern, I was accused of being judgmental. Derek had a talent for creating excuses that sounded reasonable. One month he'd be launching a new business. The next month he'd be waiting for investors. Then he'd be preparing for an opportunity that would supposedly change his life. Somehow, despite all these exciting projects, he always seemed to need help. Not dramatic amounts of help at first. Small favors. A loan here, a delayed repayment there, temporary support. Temporary became permanent years ago, but nobody seemed to notice except me. My mother always said he was trying his best. Rebecca insisted he was misunderstood. Meanwhile, I watched the same patterns repeat over and over again. About 8 months before everything collapsed, my family gathered for my mother's birthday dinner. These dinners always followed the same routine. Everyone talked about life, shared stories, and eventually Derek would dominate the room. He loved telling stories about future plans and upcoming opportunities. That evening was no different. He spoke confidently about a business venture that would supposedly generate significant income within the next year. Everyone listened with admiration. My mother smiled proudly. Rebecca looked at him with complete trust. Several relatives congratulated him before anything had even happened. I sat quietly eating my dinner because I'd heard versions of this story many times before. The details changed, but the pattern never did. Halfway through the evening, Derek suddenly looked at me and smiled. It wasn't an aggressive smile. It was worse. It was the kind of smile people use when they're about to disguise criticism as humor. He joked that I spent too much time protecting my money and not enough time enjoying life. A few people laughed. Then he joked that accountants eventually become emotionally attached to their bank accounts. More laughter followed. Rebecca playfully agreed with him, and my mother told me I should loosen up a little. I smiled politely because arguing would have ruined the evening. But something about that moment stayed with me. Not because the joke bothered me, but because of how quickly everyone joined in. It reminded me how easy it is for families to create narratives about people and how difficult those narratives become to change. A few weeks later, something unusual happened. I was reviewing my personal finances one Saturday morning when I noticed several transactions I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed there was a mistake. Thousands of dollars moved through my accounts every month because of my business, so occasional confusion wasn't uncommon. But these transactions were different. They weren't business expenses. They weren't automatic payments. They were transfers, large transfers. I immediately froze because something about them felt wrong. Over the next hour, I went through every record carefully, and with each transaction I discovered, my stomach sank a little further. By the time I finished, $48,000 had disappeared. $48,000 that I never authorized. The first thing I did was call my bank. They immediately launched an investigation and asked several security questions. During the conversation, the representative mentioned something that made my blood run cold. The transfers had been approved using information only someone very close to me could have known. My security answers had been used correctly. Personal details had been entered accurately. Whoever did this wasn't a random criminal. Whoever did this knew me. For a moment, I sat completely still in my office, trying to process what I was hearing. Then, without warning, one memory suddenly resurfaced. About 6 months earlier, Derek had asked to borrow my laptop for 20 minutes while he printed documents at my house because his printer wasn't working. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. Now, for the first time, my mind started connecting pieces I had never connected before. I didn't accuse him immediately because accusations require evidence. But for the first time in 15 years, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had spent years avoiding. What if my instincts had been right all along? What if the person everyone trusted the most was the person they should have been worried about? Unfortunately, that question would be answered much sooner than I expected. And when the truth finally came out, losing $48,000 would become the least painful part of the entire story. The next 3 days felt strange. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just strange. I continued going to work, meeting clients, reviewing financial reports, and following my normal routine. But there was a constant feeling in the back of my mind that something was wrong. $48,000 doesn't simply disappear. Numbers leave trails. That's something my grandfather taught me when I was a teenager. He used to say that people lie, memories fail, and emotions change, but numbers almost always tell the truth. Somewhere inside those transactions was the answer I needed to find. The bank's fraud department called me early Tuesday morning. The investigator explained that they had already confirmed unauthorized access to my account. Whoever made the transfers had successfully answered multiple security questions, bypassed identity checks, and authenticated the transactions from a device that wasn't mine. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten immediately. She explained that the device used for one of the transactions had previously connected to my home Wi-Fi network. For a moment, I simply sat there silently staring at my computer screen. My house wasn't a place many people visited. In fact, I could count them on one hand. My mother, my sister Rebecca, my nephew Oliver, and Derek. I didn't accuse anyone. I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I started retracing events from the past year. That's another advantage of being an accountant. We develop habits. We document things. We notice patterns. The more I reviewed my records, the more unusual things I discovered. Derek had visited my house 6 times over the previous 8 months. That wasn't particularly strange, because family visits happen all the time. What was strange was how often those visits involved technology problems. One day his printer wasn't working. Another day his laptop battery was dead. Another day he needed to send documents urgently. At the time, every situation seemed harmless. Looking back, every single excuse suddenly felt calculated. That evening, Rebecca called me. She sounded cheerful and asked if I wanted to join everyone for dinner at my mother's house on Friday. Normally, I would have said yes immediately, but something about hearing her voice made me hesitate. I wasn't angry at her. In fact, I felt sorry for her. Rebecca loved deeply, and people who love deeply sometimes become vulnerable to manipulation. She trusted Derek completely. She trusted him in ways that probably scared her if she ever stopped long enough to think about it. I agreed to dinner because part of me needed to observe him. Not accuse him, just observe him. Friday arrived, and the evening started normally. My mother was cooking in the kitchen, Rebecca was helping set the table, and Oliver was playing video games in the living room. Derek arrived 20 minutes late, carrying dessert and wearing the same confident smile he always wore. The strange thing about manipulative people is that they often appear incredibly relaxed. That's because they spend years practicing. To everyone else in the room, Derek looked completely normal. To me, something felt different. Maybe it was because I was paying attention for the first time. Maybe it was because my instincts had finally caught up with reality. Whatever the reason, I couldn't stop watching him. Halfway through dinner, Derek suddenly started talking about finances. Normally that wouldn't seem unusual because my family often asked me accounting questions. But this time the conversation felt deliberate. He joked about how I always knew exactly where every dollar went and laughed about how organized I was. Everyone smiled. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. He joked that if someone ever stole from me, they'd probably get caught within an hour. Everyone laughed again. Everyone except me. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the table. He smiled immediately afterward and took another bite of food. But something inside me shifted. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't proof. It was something else entirely. It was instinct. That night I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I got out of bed and opened an old storage box where I kept previous notebooks and household records. About 20 minutes later, I found something I had completely forgotten about. 8 months earlier, Derek had borrowed my laptop because he said he needed to complete paperwork for a loan application. I remembered that day clearly now because he had spent almost 40 minutes alone in my office while I was outside taking a phone call. At the time, I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was family, or at least I thought he was. The following morning, the fraud investigator called again. This time her voice sounded more serious. She explained that the transactions had been sent to 3 separate accounts, but all 3 accounts eventually connected to one destination. She couldn't tell me everything yet because the investigation was ongoing, but she did say one thing that changed everything. She said she believed this wasn't random fraud. She believed whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Then she asked me a direct question. Was there anyone close to me who had experienced significant financial difficulties recently? I didn't answer immediately because my mind already knew the answer. Derek. Of course it was Derek. Over the last year alone, he had talked about delayed investments, failed business opportunities, and unexpected expenses. Every conversation somehow ended with him needing more time before things improved. I suddenly realized something terrifying. Everyone else heard ambition. I heard desperation, and desperation makes people dangerous. I spent the rest of the weekend debating what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately. Part of me wanted undeniable proof first. Then on Monday morning, my phone rang again. It was my bank's legal department. The representative informed me that they had officially identified one of the destination accounts. The account wasn't in Derek's name. That would have been too obvious. Instead, it belonged to a limited liability company, a company that Derek owned. My hands immediately went cold. For several seconds, I couldn't even speak. After 15 years of suspicions, after years of watching everyone defend him, I finally had proof. Real proof. And somehow that was more painful than losing the money itself. But what happened next hurt even more. Because reporting Derek wasn't going to create a financial problem. It was going to create a family problem. And deep down, I already knew exactly who my family was going to blame. I didn't sleep much that night. Discovering that one of the accounts was connected to Derek's company changed everything. For years, I had ignored my instincts because I didn't want to be the person who created problems inside the family. Every time something felt wrong, I convinced myself I was overthinking. Every time Derek said something suspicious, I told myself I was being judgmental. Every time he needed help, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Looking back, I realized something painful. Sometimes we ignore obvious truths because accepting them would force us to change relationships we desperately want to preserve. And that was exactly what was happening. Reporting Derek wasn't just about $48,000 anymore. It meant accepting that someone I had known for 15 years had intentionally betrayed me. On Tuesday morning, I drove to the police station. The entire drive felt surreal. There wasn't any dramatic music playing in my head. There wasn't anger. There wasn't even fear. Mostly there was sadness, deep sadness, the kind that appears when you realize something can never go back to the way it was before. The officer assigned to my case was professional and patient. He listened carefully while I explained everything, reviewed the documentation from my bank, and took notes as I answered his questions. At one point, he looked up from his notebook and asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed because family fraud cases often become extremely complicated. I stared at the table for several seconds before answering. Then I said yes. For the first time in my life, I chose myself. I wasn't even back home when my phone started ringing. Rebecca's name immediately appeared on the screen. I knew exactly why she was calling. News travels incredibly fast when people are trying to protect themselves, I answered, and before I could say a single word, she exploded. She asked me if I had lost my mind. She demanded to know why I would ever involve the police. She said families don't do that to each other. She said we solve problems privately. I listened quietly because I noticed something important. Not once did she ask whether Derek stole the money. Not once did she ask if I was okay. Her entire focus was on protecting him. That realization hurt more than anything else. Then my mother called. Her voice sounded disappointed in a way I hadn't heard since childhood. She asked why I was escalating things. She told me families should forgive each other. She said people make mistakes. I sat silently listening until she said something that genuinely stunned me. She asked whether $48,000 was really worth destroying a family over. For several seconds, I couldn't even process the question. Then I calmly asked her something in return. I asked whether Derek thought our family was worth protecting before he stole $48,000 from me. The line went completely silent. My mother didn't answer because there wasn't an answer to give. That evening, Rebecca arrived at my house unexpectedly. The moment I opened the door, I could see she had been crying. She walked inside and immediately started defending Derek. According to her, he was under a lot of stress. According to her, his business wasn't doing well. According to her, he intended to repay the money eventually. The word eventually almost made me laugh. Eventually isn't permission. Eventually isn't honesty. Eventually isn't an excuse. I sat quietly until she finished talking. Then I asked a question that changed the entire conversation. I asked her if she already knew he had taken the money. Her face immediately changed. She froze for a split second before answering. That 1 second told me everything I needed to know. Rebecca started crying again and admitted that Derek had confessed 2 days earlier. He told her it was temporary. He told her he was desperate. He told her he intended to put everything back before I noticed. The moment she said that, something inside me shifted permanently. It wasn't anger anymore. It was disappointment. Years of disappointment arriving all at once. Because Derek didn't accidentally take the money. He didn't make a mistake. He planned it. He calculated it. He hoped I wouldn't discover it. And the worst part was that everyone around him was still trying to protect him. The following day, my phone started filling with messages from relatives. Apparently, Derek had already created his own version of the story. According to him, he was having financial problems and I refused to help him. According to him, I overreacted and humiliated him instead of supporting family. According to him, I was choosing money over relationships. Reading those messages felt surreal because I suddenly realized something. Manipulative people don't just steal money. They steal narratives. They work quickly to become the victim before the truth has time to spread. And unfortunately, they're often very good at it. By Thursday, several relatives stopped speaking to me entirely. My aunt sent a message saying she was disappointed in my behavior. My cousin accused me of being cold-hearted. One uncle even said I had become selfish over the years because success had changed me. I read every message quietly and noticed a pattern. Every single person was criticizing my reaction. Nobody was criticizing the theft. Somehow the crime had become secondary while my response became the problem. That was the moment I understood something terrifying about families. Sometimes people don't protect what's right. They protect what's familiar. And Derek had spent 15 years making himself familiar. Late Friday afternoon, the lead investigator called me. His voice sounded more serious than before. He informed me that this case was quickly becoming much bigger than anyone expected. Additional financial records had surfaced, and Derek's company wasn't simply struggling. It was collapsing. Outstanding debts existed everywhere. Multiple creditors were involved. Several accounts were being reviewed. Then he said something that made my heart stop. He believed I wasn't the first victim. In fact, he believed I might be one of many. I sat there silently after hanging up the phone. For years, my family saw Derek as ambitious, misunderstood, and unlucky. But maybe none of those things were true. Maybe he was simply a man who had become very skilled at hiding the consequences of his choices. The scary part wasn't realizing who Derek was. The scary part was realizing how many people had helped him become that person. And unfortunately, my family was about to learn a truth far more painful than losing money. They were about to discover that the man they had spent years defending had been lying to all of us. What none of us knew yet was that the biggest secret hadn't even been discovered. Because Derek hadn't only stolen from me, he had been stealing from people for years. And within a matter of days, that secret was about to destroy every lie he had spent 15 years building. Saturday morning started with something I never expected. My mother called before 9 o'clock, which was unusual because she never called that early unless something was wrong. The moment I answered, I could hear uncertainty in her voice for the first time since this entire situation started. She asked if we could talk privately, not at her house, not with Rebecca present, just the two of us. I agreed immediately because her tone felt different. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was cautious, almost nervous. We met at a small coffee shop 20 minutes from her house, and when I arrived, she was already sitting at a corner table staring into her coffee. She looked exhausted, older somehow, like someone who hadn't slept properly in days. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly admitted something that surprised me. She said Derek had been avoiding everyone. He wasn't answering calls. He wasn't returning messages. He kept leaving the house for hours without explanation and returning late at night. She said Rebecca was becoming increasingly anxious and that something didn't feel right anymore. I listened quietly because this was the first time she wasn't defending him. Then she asked me a question I never thought she'd ask. She wanted to know if I truly believed Derek was capable of something bigger than stealing money. I didn't answer immediately because I didn't want my emotions to control my words. Then I told her the truth. I said I didn't know what Derek was capable of anymore, and that was exactly what scared me. Later that afternoon, the investigator called again. This time his voice sounded even more serious than before. He informed me that additional financial records had surfaced overnight. My case had uncovered a larger pattern, and unfortunately, I wasn't the only victim. 3 other individuals had unknowingly transferred money into Derek's business accounts over the previous 2 years. One was an elderly man who thought he was investing in a legitimate opportunity. Another was a former co-worker who loaned him money to help launch a project that never existed. The third victim was someone who believed Derek was helping refinance a property. Hearing those stories made my stomach turn because none of these people were strangers. They were ordinary people who trusted him, just like my family trusted him, just like we all trusted him. The investigator then told me something that completely changed my understanding of the situation. Derek wasn't simply trying to survive financially. He was running a cycle. Every time he created debt, he found another person to temporarily solve it. Then he used that person's money to delay the consequences of previous mistakes. The process repeated itself over and over again for years. Investors became lenders. Lenders became victims. Victims became forgotten. Suddenly, all the stories I'd heard over the years made sense. The delayed opportunities, the failed projects, the temporary setbacks. There was never any future success coming. There was only a person desperately trying to outrun reality. That evening, Rebecca showed up at my front door again. This time she looked completely different. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she looked emotionally exhausted. She walked inside, sat on my couch, and stayed silent for almost 5 minutes before speaking. Then she said something I never expected to hear. She told me she was afraid. Not angry, not disappointed, afraid. Apparently, creditors had started calling their house non-stop. Unknown numbers kept appearing on her phone. 2 different companies had sent notices demanding immediate payment. She admitted she had no idea how much debt Derek had accumulated. Then she quietly said something that broke my heart. She told me she wasn't sure she knew who her husband was anymore. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't lecture her. I didn't remind her about the countless times I had warned everyone, because moments like that aren't victories. They're tragedies. Watching someone realize they've built their life around a lie isn't satisfying. It's painful. Rebecca sat there crying while I made tea for both of us, and for the first time in years, we weren't discussing Derek as an outsider. We were discussing him as a problem neither of us could ignore anymore. She admitted she had protected him for years because she wanted to believe he was trying his best. Every red flag became an exception. Every excuse became understandable. Every mistake became temporary. Eventually, she stopped seeing reality because hope had replaced logic. Sunday morning brought another surprise. A local business news website published an article about several financial investigations involving Derek's company. His name wasn't mentioned directly, but the details were obvious enough for anyone paying attention. Within hours, people started talking. Relatives started calling each other. Rumors spread quickly. Suddenly, the same family members who criticized me earlier became strangely quiet. Nobody apologized. Nobody admitted they were wrong. But silence can be very revealing. Sometimes silence means people are beginning to understand the truth. Then something happened that changed everything. Around 6 o'clock that evening, my mother called again. This time she was crying. She said she had discovered something while helping Rebecca organize paperwork at the house. Derek had secretly opened a credit card in Rebecca's name nearly 2 years earlier. Thousands of dollars had accumulated without her knowledge. The moment my mother told me, I closed my eyes and felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. Because crossing that line changes everything. Stealing from family is terrible. Stealing from your own spouse is something else entirely. For the first time since this began, my mother sounded broken. She admitted she had spent years defending him. She admitted she had judged me unfairly. Most importantly, she admitted she ignored her instincts because she wanted peace more than she wanted truth. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. Wanting peace more than truth. How many families do that every single day? How many people tolerate unhealthy situations simply because confronting them feels uncomfortable? Probably far more than we realize. That night, I sat alone in my living room staring at the rain outside my window. I kept thinking about something my grandfather used to say. He believed lies work like interest payments. They start small and manageable, but eventually they become too large to control. Derek had spent 15 years borrowing time from reality, and now reality was demanding payment all at once. The scary part was that I still didn't know how bad things really were. Because according to the investigator, there were still missing records they hadn't found yet. And he believed those missing records would reveal something much bigger than financial theft. What none of us knew yet was that within 48 hours, Derek's biggest secret would be exposed. And the moment that happened, nobody in my family would ever be able to defend him again. Monday morning started with a phone call that changed everything. It was Rebecca, but she wasn't crying this time. She sounded numb. There was something unsettling about her voice, because emotional people eventually reach a point where they stop crying altogether. That's usually when the situation becomes truly serious. She asked if she could come over immediately, and before I could answer, she said she had discovered something she didn't know how to process. 20 minutes later, she arrived carrying a folder and a laptop. She sat at my kitchen table without saying a word for almost a full minute. Then she opened the folder and pushed several papers toward me. At first, I thought they were more credit card statements. They weren't. They were lease agreements, payment records, and bank transfers connected to an apartment across town, an apartment Rebecca had never seen before. I looked at her carefully before asking the obvious question. She shook her head and said she didn't know who lived there. She discovered the address while reviewing financial records connected to Derek's accounts. At first, she assumed it was another failed business venture. But when she dug deeper, she realized something terrifying. Utilities were active, furniture payments existed, monthly grocery purchases appeared regularly. Somebody had been living there for over a year. Rebecca stared at the table while speaking because saying the words out loud made them real. Then she quietly admitted she believed Derek had been living a second life. Not necessarily another marriage, but another version of himself. A place where he could disappear whenever reality became too difficult to manage. I didn't know what to say. Because suddenly this story wasn't about money anymore. Money can be replaced. Trust cannot. Rebecca sat there trying to understand how 15 years of marriage could hide something this large. Then she asked a question people ask themselves every day after discovering betrayal. She wanted to know how she missed it. The answer was heartbreaking because it was simple. She didn't miss it. She ignored it. We all ignore warning signs when accepting the truth feels too painful. Late nights became business meetings. Unexplained absences became opportunities. Stress became an excuse. Over time, excuses pile up until they eventually become an entire false reality. Around lunchtime, the investigator called me again. He informed me that several additional victims had already contacted authorities after hearing about the investigation. One woman claimed Derek convinced her to invest $22,000 in a project that never existed. Another man loaned him $30,000 after being promised repayment within 6 months. Every single story sounded familiar. Hope, urgency, promises, delays, excuses. Then, silence. Derek wasn't improvising anymore. He had perfected a system. The investigator then said something that shocked me. According to preliminary estimates, Derek may have accumulated over $300,000 in unauthorized debts over the last 5 years. When I heard that number, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. $300,000. Nobody accidentally creates that kind of destruction. By late afternoon, my phone started filling with messages from relatives again. But this time, the tone had changed completely. People who criticized me a few days earlier were suddenly asking if I was okay. My aunt apologized for judging me. My cousin admitted he had jumped to conclusions. One uncle even called personally to say he regretted defending Derek without knowing the facts. I appreciated the apologies, but something inside me had changed. I wasn't angry anymore. I simply understood something I didn't understand before. Most people don't choose truth immediately. They choose comfort. Only when comfort becomes impossible do they finally accept reality. That evening, my mother invited everyone to her house. Not for a celebration, not for a holiday. She wanted the entire family together. The atmosphere felt heavy the moment I walked inside. Nobody was smiling. Nobody was making small talk. Even Oliver seemed unusually quiet. Rebecca sat on one side of the room holding tissues in her hands. My mother looked exhausted. Several relatives had come because everyone finally understood how serious the situation had become. Then my mother stood up and did something I never expected. She publicly apologized to me in front of everyone. For several seconds, nobody moved. She admitted she had judged me unfairly. She admitted she defended Derek because she wanted to believe he was a good person. She admitted she ignored warning signs because accepting them would have created conflict inside the family. Then she said something that made the entire room silent. She said that peace built on lies is never real peace. It only delays the pain. Hearing those words felt strange because for the first time in years, nobody was arguing. Nobody was defending Derek. Everyone was simply listening. Then Rebecca spoke. Her voice was shaking, but she remained composed. She explained everything she had discovered over the last 48 hours. The hidden apartment, the debts, the secret accounts, the fake business projects. Every new detail made the room quieter. At one point, my aunt covered her mouth in shock. My cousin stared at the floor. My mother began crying again. It felt surreal because the image everyone spent 15 years protecting was disappearing right in front of us. Piece by piece, illusion was becoming reality. Then something happened that none of us expected. Derek walked through the front door. Nobody had invited him. Nobody knew he was coming. He looked exhausted, but somehow he still carried that same familiar confidence. For a brief moment, I saw the old Derek again. The man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. He stood in the middle of the room and immediately started explaining. According to him, everyone was overreacting. According to him, everything could still be fixed. According to him, people were making assumptions. The strange thing was that he sounded exactly the same as always. The only difference was that nobody believed him anymore. Then Rebecca stood up. She looked directly at him and asked one simple question. Who lives in the apartment? For the first time in 15 years, Derek didn't have an answer. He froze. Complete silence filled the room. Then he looked away. That tiny movement said more than any confession ever could. Rebecca immediately understood. She sat back down and began crying quietly while everyone else stared in disbelief. But that wasn't even the worst part. Because just before leaving, Derek said something that changed the entire situation. He admitted there were things nobody knew yet. Then he said lawyers would probably contact us soon. The moment he said those words, my heart sank. Lawyers, which meant this was no longer a family problem. This was becoming something much bigger, and unfortunately, he was right. Because the following morning, we would discover a secret that would completely destroy the version of Derek everyone had spent 15 years believing in. Tuesday morning arrived much faster than anyone expected. After everything that happened the previous night, nobody in my family slept properly. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Rebecca. Her voice sounded calm, which honestly worried me more than hearing her cry. People eventually reach a point where emotions become too heavy to carry, and instead of breaking down, they become strangely quiet. She asked if I could come over, because lawyers had already contacted her. I grabbed my keys and drove there immediately. The moment I walked inside the house, I could tell something significant had happened. Derek was gone. His closet was half empty. Several drawers had been cleared out, and his laptop was missing. Rebecca was sitting at the dining room table, holding a stack of documents. She looked exhausted, but there was something else in her expression too. Acceptance. Sometimes acceptance is the final stage of grief because it's the moment a person stops fighting reality. She quietly explained that 2 different law firms had contacted her that morning regarding unpaid debts connected to Derek's business accounts. One company was demanding immediate repayment. Another company was preparing legal action. Then she showed me a document that completely changed everything. It wasn't another debt notice. It was a list of shell companies Derek had created over the last 6 years. 5 different companies, 5 different names, 5 different stories. Suddenly, all those business opportunities he talked about over the years finally made sense. I sat there looking at the papers while my stomach slowly sank. This wasn't one mistake. This wasn't temporary financial hardship. This was a system. Derek had spent years building a network of fake opportunities designed to buy himself more time. Every time one company started failing, he created another one. Every time one story stopped working, he invented a new one. It was a cycle that only survived because people trusted him. The scary part wasn't his intelligence. It was his patience. He had been planning these things for years, while all of us sat around dinner tables believing every word he said. Around noon, the investigator called me with another update. This time his tone sounded different. He informed me that authorities had uncovered evidence suggesting Derek falsified multiple documents over several years. Some signatures didn't belong to the people listed. Some agreements were completely fabricated. Then he said something that made me stop breathing for a moment. According to the evidence, Derek had attempted to access my accounts more than once. $48,000 wasn't his first attempt. It was simply the first successful one. Hearing that felt like someone punching me in the chest because it changed everything. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was intentional behavior. He had been planning ways to take from me for a long time. Later that afternoon, my mother came over to Rebecca's house. The moment she walked inside, she looked at both of us and started crying. She wasn't crying because of Derek anymore. She was crying because she blamed herself. She admitted she had ignored warning signs for years because she wanted to protect the image of our family. She said she believed keeping everyone together was more important than asking difficult questions. Then she said something that nobody expected. She apologized directly to Rebecca. She said she helped create an environment where Derek never had to face consequences because someone was always willing to defend him. The room became completely silent after that because deep down, everyone knew she was right. That evening, Rebecca made one of the hardest decisions of her life. She told us she was leaving him, not temporarily, not until things calmed down, permanently. She explained that trust wasn't something she could rebuild after discovering years of lies. Then she quietly admitted something heartbreaking. She said she wasn't grieving her marriage. She was grieving the person she thought she married. That sentence stayed with me because it perfectly described betrayal. People often think betrayal is about discovering who someone truly is. In reality, betrayal is grieving someone who never actually existed. The following morning, news spread quickly throughout our extended family. Suddenly, relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years started reaching out. Everyone wanted to apologize. Everyone wanted to explain themselves. But something inside me had changed permanently. I wasn't angry anymore. I simply understood human nature better. People often protect comfort before they protect truth. They choose the explanation that creates the least conflict. Unfortunately, that's exactly why manipulative people succeed for so long. They know most people don't want difficult answers. They want easy ones. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, I received one final call from the investigator. He told me Derek had voluntarily contacted his attorney and planned to cooperate with authorities. Then he said something surprising. According to Derek's statement, he never intended to hurt anyone. I almost laughed when I heard those words because they perfectly captured his entire personality. Even now, after years of deception, he still viewed himself as someone caught in unfortunate circumstances instead of someone responsible for his own actions. That's the dangerous thing about people like Derek. They rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as victims of situations they created. That night, I sat alone in my living room thinking about everything that had happened over the last week. 7 days earlier, I thought $48,000 was the biggest problem in my life. Now it felt insignificant compared to everything else we had discovered. Money wasn't the real loss. Trust was. Years of trust. Years of family dinners. Years of memories. Years of believing someone was a different person than they actually were. That was the real cost of all of this, but the story still wasn't over. Because even though Derek had disappeared, his final decision was about to surprise everyone. Within 48 hours, he would ask to meet the entire family one last time. And during that meeting, he would reveal something none of us saw coming. Something that would force every person in that room to rethink the last 15 years of our lives. Thursday afternoon, my mother called everyone and said Derek wanted to meet one final time. Nobody was excited about the idea. In fact, nobody even knew if they wanted to see him again. But curiosity can be powerful, especially after a betrayal. Sometimes people need answers before they can finally let go. We agreed to meet at my mother's house because none of us wanted to give the situation any more importance than it already had. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt different from every other family gathering we'd ever had. Nobody was talking much. There was no television playing in the background. No laughter. No small talk. Everyone seemed emotionally exhausted. We had all spent the last week processing years of lies, and the weight of that reality was finally beginning to settle in. About 15 minutes later, Derek walked through the front door. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't look like the same person. There was no confidence, no carefully crafted smile, no energy. He looked tired in a way I had never seen before. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. He sat down quietly without saying anything for several seconds. Nobody rushed to speak because there was nothing left to pretend about anymore. Finally, he looked around the room and apologized. The strange thing was that hearing those words didn't create relief. It didn't create anger either. It created emptiness. Sometimes apologies arrive too late. Sometimes people spend so much time destroying trust that the words themselves lose their meaning. Then he started talking. He explained that years ago, he experienced his first business failure and became terrified of being viewed as a disappointment. Instead of telling the truth, he lied. The first lie was small. Then another one followed. Eventually, lying became easier than admitting failure. According to him, he spent years trying to build a version of himself that everyone would admire. Every fake opportunity, every invented project, and every excuse existed for one reason. He didn't want anyone to see him as unsuccessful. As he spoke, I realized something important. His greatest fear wasn't poverty. It wasn't losing money. It was losing approval. And somewhere along the way, that fear became stronger than his conscience. Rebecca sat quietly listening to every word. Then she asked the question everyone wanted answered. She asked why he stole from her family. Derek immediately lowered his eyes and took a deep breath. He admitted something that shocked everyone in the room. He said he never believed he'd get caught because we trusted him too much. Hearing those words felt like being punched in the chest. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Trust is a beautiful thing when it's given to the right people. In the wrong hands, trust becomes a weapon. For years, we gave him unlimited access to our lives because we believed family automatically deserved trust. Unfortunately, trust should never be automatic. It should always be protected. Then Derek looked directly at me for the first time all evening. He apologized for stealing my money, but then he said something that surprised me. He admitted the $48,000 was never really about survival. It was about desperation. He had reached a point where every lie required another lie to survive. Every debt required another victim. Every excuse required another excuse. He compared it to drowning. At first you think you're swimming. Then suddenly you realize you're only delaying the inevitable. Listening to him, I finally understood something. Derek wasn't evil. He was weak. Weak people often become dangerous because they prioritize escaping consequences over making difficult decisions. Then he revealed one final secret. 3 years earlier, he had already considered confessing everything. He even wrote a letter admitting his problems. But he never sent it because he was afraid everyone would leave him. The irony was impossible to ignore. The one thing he feared most was exactly what his actions created. Years of deception had eventually isolated him anyway. Sometimes people spend so much energy avoiding consequences that they accidentally build them themselves. My mother was crying quietly by this point. Rebecca looked emotionally drained. Several relatives sat silently staring at the floor. Nobody interrupted because there wasn't anything left to say. Eventually, my mother asked one final question. She wanted to know whether any of the last 15 years had been real. Derek immediately answered yes. He said he genuinely loved Rebecca. He genuinely loved Oliver. He genuinely cared about the family. The problem was that he loved approval more than honesty. That sentence changed the entire room, because suddenly, everyone understood something uncomfortable. Good people are capable of terrible decisions when fear controls their lives. Rebecca eventually stood up. The room immediately became quiet because everyone knew this was the moment that mattered most. She walked over to him and spoke calmly. She said she forgave him, but she wasn't coming back. She explained that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. People often confuse the two. Forgiveness allows you to let go of anger. Reconciliation requires rebuilding trust. And trust, once destroyed repeatedly over 15 years, cannot simply be rebuilt because someone finally tells the truth. Derek nodded quietly because deep down he already knew that. As the evening came to an end, Derek stood up to leave. He paused near the front door and looked back at everyone one final time. Then he said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. He said the worst punishment wasn't the investigation, the lawsuits, or the financial collapse. The worst punishment was realizing he had become someone he didn't even recognize anymore. Then he quietly walked out the front door and disappeared into the night. None of us stopped him. Not because we didn't care, but because sometimes people have to rebuild their lives on their own. No amount of family support can replace personal accountability. That's a journey every person has to take by themselves. As I drove home that night, I realized something strange. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Not happy, not victorious, just calm. Because the truth was finally out in the open. Nobody was pretending anymore. Nobody was protecting illusions anymore. We were simply dealing with reality. And reality, even when painful, is easier to live with than lies. What I didn't know at that moment was that one final chapter still remained. Because over the next year, our family would slowly rebuild itself in ways none of us expected. And in the process, we would all learn a lesson far more valuable than $48,000 could ever buy. 1 year passed much faster than I expected. In some ways, life looked completely different. In other ways, it looked exactly the same. I still woke up early every morning. I still drove to my accounting firm. I still enjoyed the simple routines I had built over the years. The strange thing about surviving a major life event is that eventually, ordinary life returns. At first, that feels strange because you expect everything to remain dramatic forever. Then one day you realize that healing often arrives quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It slowly appears inside normal moments. A peaceful morning, a phone call from someone you love, a quiet dinner without tension. Eventually, those moments become your new normal. The family also changed in ways I never expected. Not overnight, not perfectly. Real healing doesn't work that way. Instead, it happened through dozens of small conversations over many months. My mother stopped trying to avoid difficult discussions. Rebecca stopped carrying problems by herself. Relatives became more thoughtful before offering opinions. We all learned something valuable. Protecting someone's feelings should never come at the expense of protecting the truth. For years, we believed keeping peace meant staying silent. Now we understood that silence often allows problems to grow until they become impossible to ignore. Rebecca eventually moved into a small townhouse across town with Oliver. The first few months were difficult for her because she was rebuilding her life from the ground up. But slowly things improved. She found confidence she didn't know she had. She managed her own finances, created healthy boundaries, and stopped making excuses for other people's choices. One afternoon, while we were having coffee together, she said something that stayed with me for a long time. She admitted she wasn't angry anymore. She was grateful. At first, I didn't understand what she meant. Then she explained that discovering the truth, painful as it was, gave her a second chance at life. Sometimes the worst day of your life becomes the first day of a better one. My mother changed too. She no longer tried to keep everyone happy all the time. That might sound small, but for her it was enormous. For decades, she believed her job was to protect the family from conflict. Then she realized something important. Avoiding conflict and avoiding truth are two very different things. She learned that healthy families don't survive because they never have difficult conversations. They survive because they're willing to have them. Looking back, she admitted that many of our problems didn't start with Derek. They started long before him. We had simply become a family that feared uncomfortable truths. Derek just happened to take advantage of that weakness. As for Derek, we heard very little about him over the next year. The investigations eventually concluded. Agreements were reached. Debts were restructured. Some money was recovered while some was lost permanently. But strangely enough, none of those things mattered anymore. The money stopped being important months ago. What mattered was what we learned from the experience. Every once in a while, Rebecca would receive updates through lawyers, but emotionally, she had already moved on. She no longer allowed his choices to control her future. That's another thing I learned during this entire process. Healing doesn't happen when someone apologizes. Healing happens when you stop giving them control over your peace. One Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after everything started, my mother invited everyone over for dinner again. The moment I walked into her house, I noticed something different. The atmosphere felt light. There was laughter in the kitchen. Oliver was running around playing games. My mother was smiling. Rebecca looked genuinely happy. For the first time in a very long time, nobody seemed worried about appearances. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. Nobody was pretending life was perfect. We were simply together, and somehow that felt more meaningful than every family dinner we'd had over the last 15 years. At one point during the evening, my mother asked me a question. She wanted to know whether I regretted filing the report. The room immediately became quiet, because everyone already knew how much had changed since that day. I thought about the answer carefully because it deserved honesty. Then I said no. I didn't regret it. In fact, I regretted waiting so long to trust my instincts. Because that's the lesson this entire experience taught me. Ignoring your instincts doesn't create peace. It only postpones the truth. Everyone sat quietly for a moment after I said that. Then Rebecca smiled and agreed. She admitted that for years she confused loyalty with protection. She believed being loyal meant defending someone no matter what they did. Now she understood that real loyalty sometimes means holding people accountable. Real love isn't about protecting people from consequences. It's about helping them become better versions of themselves. And sometimes that means telling difficult truths instead of comforting lies. As the evening came to an end, I stood outside on my mother's porch, looking at the sunset. It reminded me of something my grandfather used to say. He believed every family carries two stories: the story they tell the world and the story they tell themselves. Problems begin when those two stories become completely different. For years, our family told ourselves that we were protecting each other. In reality, we were protecting an illusion. The moment we finally accepted the truth, everything changed. Looking back now, I realized this was never a story about $48,000. It wasn't even a story about theft. It was a story about trust, about assumptions, about accountability. Most importantly, it was a story about courage. Because sometimes courage isn't doing something dramatic. Sometimes courage is filing a report when everyone tells you not to. Sometimes courage is asking difficult questions. Sometimes courage is choosing truth even when you know it will upset the people you love. Today, if someone asks me what I learned from all of this, I give them the same answer every time. Never confuse peace with silence. Never confuse loyalty with blindness. And never ignore your instincts simply because the truth feels uncomfortable. The people who truly love you may not always agree with you in the moment, but eventually, truth has a way of revealing itself. And if there's one thing this entire experience taught me, it's this: protecting your peace is never selfish. Protecting the truth is never selfish. Holding someone accountable for their actions is never selfish. The only selfish thing is expecting someone else to carry the consequences of choices you willingly made yourself. For years, my family called me selfish for filing that report. Today, none of them use that word anymore, because they finally learned something that took all of us far too long to understand. Choosing yourself is not selfish when someone else has spent years choosing themselves at your expense. And honestly, that lesson was worth far more than $48,000.